There we go. I think we're set now.
All right, yeah, everything sounds
Yeah,
good on my end. So,
there we go.
yeah,
All right. Okay. So yeah, no, thank you for having me on there. I wasn't first of all, I gotta thank you again for your donation with the Kenny Irwin Foundation on the auction there. And that was really cool. I hope I definitely made sure to send over the information there to you so they got the donation made in your name and everything. So
yeah.
much
Well,
appreciated.
yeah, thank you. And I got the tracking information. I work at the UPS store now, so I'm
Oh,
aware of how
perfect.
long it takes for ground to get from the East Coast or get to the East Coast, I guess, coming from California. So it
Ooh,
hasn't gotten here yet, but I'll keep an eye out. I'll certainly let you know when it arrives. But yeah, I appreciate getting the opportunity to do that. I'm glad I was able to add to my collection and support a good cause at the same time. So that was very nice.
absolutely. Definitely.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for coming on tonight. I don't want to take up too much
Oh,
of your evening
sure.
here. I want to keep it to about an hour or so, hopefully.
Okay.
And like what Dale Jr. says on his podcast a lot of times. I'd love to have you back at some point because I'm sure there's more than an hour's worth of material we could talk about here. But you know,
Certainly.
I I don't want to monopolize too much of your evening at the same time here. So, but I
No, I
guess
appreciate it.
just to start, and forgive me in advance. I know I got to talk to you last year for
Mhm.
one of my school projects. But just for the sake of people who might be watching this who maybe don't know as much about the Lastcar website or kind of the mission of what you do, I guess just kind of explain to people to start why last place finishers and what got the website going.
Well, it's always a great icebreaker, the way I always put it, because what I do is I follow the last place finishers in NASCAR's top three series. So I always kind of turn the field on its head there and kind of start watching the race from the very back of the field and chronicle what happens from the start of the race until the driver falls out. And by doing that, that allows me to kind of follow different drivers and teams that don't get talked about as often. Every once in a while, we do get a driver like a Chase Elliott or, back when he was active, Dale Jr., the like, that would fall to the back of the field and they would be the story that way too. Never really could play favorites. And at the end of the year, there's a last car champion that is the driver that gets the most last place finishes out of the season. I have kind of a point structure that's set up there that favors kind of more full-time drivers rather than part-timers. And at the end of the year, if I'm at the finale or very close to it, I actually present the certificate to the driver that had the most last place finishes. And just got finished doing that at Phoenix just this past weekend. So yeah, it's an entertaining site. I've been doing it since 2009. I've never really been a guy that's been a big fan of a lot of the big name drivers out there, although I certainly know why people are fans of them. But this is kind of a framework that allows me to kind of talk about drivers that don't get talked about that much. And certainly you understand that as well from your own contributions to the site there with the Arca West series and so forth.
Yeah, well, I'm sitting kind of low here. I don't know if you can tell, but I've got my Jeff Green
Oh, there we
shirt on
go.
tonight. Yeah, so yeah, but I'm curious because I know obviously you got to present that to Jeff at Darlington a handful of years ago. I can understand where if it's somebody in his situation where he's just kind of doing it. I think he mentioned like he sees his starting park work as kind of a job now for him. And obviously he's an actual Xfinity Series champion as well, so we don't want to discredit him in any sort of way. But
Oh,
somebody like
exactly.
that, I would think they might appreciate the work that you do and understand and appreciate having a media member to talk to, considering they're at the back of the pack, don't get as much attention on a typical race weekend. But have you ever run into a situation where it's like, a top driver just has, maybe a handful of early crashes or engine failures at the start of a year, and it's a top name. It actually ends up being the quote unquote last car champion, and they maybe don't understand the premise of the site or just think you're maybe making fun of them or something like that.
I mean, that's certainly an aspect of it. I mean, I'm still kind of perfecting my approach to it. This is only the second time I've actually presented the certificates in person, so that's kind of been a more recent phenomena compared to the actual history of the website. But obviously, there's been differing reactions from one driver to the next. I pretty much got three very different reactions from this past Phoenix weekend alone. But it's actually interesting you mentioned Jeff Green. Back in Las Vegas during our coverage there, I actually ran to Rick Houston at the Scene Vault podcast. He was doing a couple presentations there on racing history, and he specifically asked me about Jeff Green and his reaction to receiving the shirt like the one you're wearing there tonight. And I told him, yeah, we don't, he was pretty laid back about it. He said like, man, I didn't think I had 100 yet. I said like, well, he had 100 combined across the top 3 series, not just 100 in Xfinity yet, and he did later that year. So it was all kept pretty light, and and he also actually, his dog had passed away not long before this. This was back in 2017. I sent a message to him, wishing him the best under that, and he remembered that, and he mentioned that actually during that same interview. But when I was describing all this to Rick Houston, he just had this big smile on his face, and he's like, and I got a very good sense that the Jeff Green that I was talking to was very different than the Jeff Green that he talked to back in the 90s when he was covering the Busch series for NASCAR Scene. And I'm sure if I had presented the certificate back then, I think, in fact, he actually got a Lastcar championship back in like 96 or 97 or so. I'm sure if I had been around back then, even doing it under the same circumstances, probably would have got a very different reaction then. But to answer your question about drivers that I've personally brought them to, David Starr, for example, he was very cool about it. He was very laid back about it. And I had an interview with him that I integrated into the article I did that week. And, I didn't just say, hey, here right away. I kind of eased into it and talked more about his racing and his season. And I got a good interview out of it. And then I kind of did at the end. And I could tell when I did give him the certificate at the end, he was, he didn't know what to make of it. And I'm sure when I described it, he was like, well, this is something he's not going to really exactly put on his wall. And, but he was very professional about it. And I'm sure of all these drivers, I'm sure none of them really anticipate having to be in a situation where they receive an award like this. But, but again, he was really cool about it. Jack Wood in the Truck Series, he actually laughed when I gave him his. And Joey Gase in the Cup Series, I caught him just on the way out, so I didn't do a whole interview. I actually gave him the certificate at the beginning, and that really kind of illustrated how awkward that can be, because he absolutely didn't understand it, but he accepted it, and he wasn't offended. And I kind of led into talking about his season a bit, but that was just kind of brief on that end. So you kind of have to judge it from one situation to another. I did give one to Joe Nemechek a couple of years ago. I think he wasn't particularly happy about it, but that was at a time where, much like Jeff Green, he was starting parking his effort. At the time, John Hunter was still driving for his team and helping them out. And, it wasn't any reflection on Joe's driving skill. And we didn't really have an opportunity to really talk about that. But it can happen. And there's certainly drivers and team owners for that matter that aren't particularly big fans of him. I actually, had one team owner reach out to me on Twitter and ask me, why do you hate us? And I said, well, look, I don't. I love writing about you guys. I hate that you have bad runs, but I try to really explain these away. I mean, there's other guys in the media center who, I've sat around where either they don't pay attention to them at all, or they just laugh when something bad happens to them. And I think that's much more mean-spirited than anything I or you or anybody else contributing to Lastcar.info does. I think we all share that interest in these drivers and teams, and understand that, they're racing for the very best they can. And a lot of them are happy to get that bit of exposure there. And sometimes it doesn't always come across as clearly, but I think a lot have really come around to it. I mean, Josh Bilicki on pit road at Phoenix was asking if he was going to get a certificate. And I said, no, not this year, but your teammate might. And he was talking, he was explaining it with his friends, and they were interested in it. And, so that was cool. So there's definitely some that do get it and some that don't. And, I can only do so much to convince them of it. But, when Quinn Houff wrecked at Phoenix, and somebody sitting next to me is like, well, that's a perfect way for that team to go out, and just leaving it there and never going out there to talk to the guys. I think at the end of the day, a team would rather somebody go out there and talk to them and find out what happened versus the opposite. So it just is what it is.
Yeah, well, I want to ask, I know you brought up Jeff Green getting a Lastcar championship back in the 90s. It reminded me, I know you were taking the bar exam and you were a law student many years ago. I'm curious, how long did it take you to compile all these stats and put them together and look at the history books and kind of create, I guess they're Kindle books, right? The ones that you update every year.
Oh,
With the
yes. Yep.
statistics. How long did all that take to put together?
That was very challenging. Yeah, it's a good question. It's the idea first came about in November, basically after the 2008 season had wrapped up. And of course, the big news, even at that time, was all these teams shutting down and new teams starting up. And that was kind of a continuing story through 2008 and early 2009. And at the same time, my brother, aka Last Bro, you may see his name, that hashtag pop up here and there on my Twitter feed. He came up with the ideas. He asked me just one night, he said, like, well, who has the most last place finishes? Like, nobody ever talks about that. And I looked at J Ski and I didn't see anything there. And I looked at these other sites and nobody really talked about it. And so I just kind of went back to 1998, just kind of picked an arbitrary period back when 43 car field started and kind of figured out the stats. I think Derek Cope had the most for that time period. And after that, it just kind of built from there. The biggest thing I think that helped it, and I have to give a shout out to them, is racingreference.info. The time that they were briefly like offline was terrifying to me because they have been absolutely essential in compiling a lot of these stats. Same thing with my entry list storylines articles and things of that nature. That site really helped me. I was originally on like just a Word document when I compiled it, and then I converted that over into a Excel spreadsheet years later. But to answer your question, it was basically by the end of the off season into early 2009 when I started actually writing my first Lastcar articles. I had just the Cup Series statistics. I didn't have anything on Xfinity or trucks. I finished that by midway into the 2010 season. And then the books you're describing, I didn't finish those until 2012, early 2013. So that took a bit longer as well. So it did take a few years to really get that together. And even then, in that time since then, I added extra columns of data for the manufacturers of the cars, other notes on, certain events that happened during the races, and really kind of added more and more to that spreadsheet. And just this year added statistics on dirt tracks. I think that was the most recent stat page I had on that. So in anticipation of Bristol, of course, I kind of compiled that. So it's a long process there. And, and yeah, obviously that was a challenge back when I was in law school. That finished up in 2011. And I kind of chronicled that a little bit in my Dan Weldon video a while back. That was kind of that time period. And I kind of transitioned kind of out of that and into more the media side at the same time. That's where it allowed me to kind of spend more time on, writing the history books and so forth.
Well, that was a perfect segue. I was just going to bring up the Until Lap 11 documentary, which you put out last month. I guess it'll be a month ago tomorrow here on the day we're recording this. I remember you mentioned, I guess toward the end of the video, when Jason Leffler passed away. And I think, I remember watching that race at Pocono, and because I've always been a fan of the underdogs myself, obviously, and just kind of seeing Leffler's name scroll by on the ticker, and then eventually, the word off, shifts to out, and the car's out of the race, and he ends up finishing last place that weekend, and then just a few days later, he's killed at a local race that he's running. And I guess that was kind of the realization that, everybody's talking about Leffler now, obviously, and reminiscing on his career. And he was in a cup race just a few days earlier, and your site was the only site that was talking about that. So I guess, and I've seen the video, obviously, so I think I already know the answer, but, what did that do for kind of how the website evolved going forward, and kind of the mission of what you continue to do to this day?
It's a good question. I mean, you certainly look back at the older archives, and you see an article from 2009, 2010, 2011. Those first 3 years, the site was kind of secondary to, at the time I was doing the NASCAR starting grid videos on YouTube. And that was kind of my big focus, because I was like, this is on YouTube, and it got a decent amount of hits. And I'm like, this is kind of the direction I'm probably going to go. And the site, that's kind of a fun thing to kind of do on the side. The articles don't really go in depth about the drivers themselves, and it's mostly focusing on updating the statistics. Although I certainly had an interest in these teams, they're not very comprehensive articles, certainly those first 3 years. Um, into 2011, 2012, of course, the Dan Weldon accident was, yeah, a critical element in that. As I chronicled in the video there, I was in that particular chat room that's featured in the video. And again, it allowed me to kind of indulge in more of the fan side of things, kind of separate from this media side. And I never really, I mean, I'd always kind of thought in the back of my head, I wanted to kind of do something in media, but I didn't really think that the Lastcar site was going to be kind of the vehicle to get there, because I always felt like it was kind of a niche thing. But I could tell over that same time, the videos were, the starting grid videos are getting they kind of flatlined. I mean, they were decently popular, and I still get a lot of people that ask me about them, but they kind of plateaued, and the site was kind of starting to get a little bit more attention. And so I was kind of shifting my focus that way about 2011. And then when the Weldon accident happened, that was where, I try to keep things light in like my starting grid videos. And then the website kind of gives me an outlet to kind of do more like reporting and stuff like that. That was kind of where it kind of shifted that direction a little bit. And I don't think it was really as conscious at the time, but the video I linked in the description there as well, where I kind of offered my thoughts about it. It's very similar to a lot of the videos I do now, where I'm talking about like kind of my thoughts firsthand after a race, and it's closer to where I was kind of headed, but I didn't really think I was, headed that direction. But it definitely was kind of starting that. I mean, I really stopped going to the chat room, not immediately after the Weldon thing, but a ways after it. It's been a few years since I've been by there. Apparently it's still active, but I just, as I said in the video, I couldn't really reconcile this increasing interest in trying to kind of go to the media writing angle and still kind of doing the fan side of it. And I think that was kind of part of it. But the Jason Leffler one was really was the breaking point, because at that point I thought since the Weldon thing that I was kind of taking more interest in it and really writing decent features on these drivers and really bringing them more attention. And I did write that article, but even when I look back at it, it's like, well, it's still not very in depth. There's still some information that could be brought up more. And it would have been great if I had actually interviewed him, or if I was actually at the track to talk with him and things like that. And that kind of got me thinking at that point. And so by 2014, that was the first time I actually covered a race under the Lastcar banner. And by then, I was barely doing the starting grids anymore. I still do them, here and there with the Patreon and so forth. But that was really critical in that sense. And you'll see, a lot of my articles. I mean, actually, my article for Jeffrey Earnhardt Saturday at Phoenix, I mean, it took me almost till midnight to finish that, because there was just so much information. And that was kind of when I decided that the site was going to be kind of more going to be my focus. And I had to just really, take that aside. I mean, just this past weekend at Phoenix, this is probably one of the first race weekends I can remember where I didn't even go to the fan zone. Like, I mean, I usually like try to kind of look out there, whether I'm meeting up with people or just kind of look at the souvenir haulers. I would have never thought, as like, even in high school or even in college, that I wouldn't make time to check that stuff out. I never did this weekend because there was just so much stuff happening in the infield during that weekend. I never really got a chance to get out of there. And that in 2011 with Dan Weldon, or 2013 with Jason Leffler, that would have been unthinkable for me. And I think you sometimes in life, you never really know, you don't have it be a conscious decision where you realize, oh man, this is something I need to change this and do this. You don't realize that change has happened until you're further back looking back on it. And when I put the lap 11 video together, that really kind of, I felt like I was kind of understanding it as I was making it. And I'm glad that it was an uncomfortable project in a lot of ways, because I think it was reliving a time where it was kind of an uncomfortable transition, and all that too. Ultimately I didn't pass the bar exam. That was kind of a whole other story that, with that too. But, I found their interest with that too, where I was interested more in an administrative side of the law, rather than actually practicing it. So I was discovering a lot about myself in that time. And there were painful lessons, but important ones. And I hope that came across. And I did receive some compliments on it, even at the track at Phoenix. So I was pleased to hear that, because that was a project I was very, very nervous about in putting out there for sure.
Yeah, well, I guess to kind of bounce off of that, I know you've been a lot more active on YouTube, and in recent years, but if you go back into the archives of your channel, you find all the starting grid videos. And I even remember the All-Star race. I guess it was probably 2011 or 2012 when you got on Speed Channel to introduce Regan Smith.
From Cato, New York, driver of the number 78 Chevrolet, your 2011 winner of the Southern 500, sleek and swift, it is Regan Smith.
I guess he was in the All-Star race by virtue of his Southern 500 win. So I know that you had a lot of fun putting those together. So kind of tell me how that project got started.
Oh, that was such an interesting time. Again, kind of a nucleus of it, that was also kind of a moment that was kind of a collision course of a lot of these things going on. In May of 2012, that same weekend was the weekend I received my score back from my second attempt at the bar exam. That same night, and didn't pass it there. But I had received word that I sent a submission in with Regan Smith, and Regan's win at Darlington was obviously one thing I chased a lot in the starting grids was the frustration of Smith not getting that Talladega win, that yellow line rule penalty. I still stand by the fact that I think that's one of the worst calls NASCAR has made. And the inconsistencies with the yellow line rule since then have pointed that out, but that's a whole other discussion for another day. When Regan was, of course, in the All-Star race and making it in there, when I heard they were doing this contest, I had to jump into it because at that point I hadn't really done any starting grids first part of 2012 at all. So I figured, well, this would be kind of fun. And so I did that with the diecast. I still have the car with that. And one thing that's interesting is they almost didn't get me into that contest. What happened was there was confusion because Speed had aired some of the clips beforehand, and they thought that I had published my clip on my YouTube channel beforehand, which you weren't supposed to. It would have violated the contest rules. And so originally they weren't going to give me the helmet. They weren't going to put my clip in the race. They're going to get somebody else's thing or something. And I had to explain to him, I was like, no, you guys were airing the clip. It wasn't me. I didn't have anything to do with that. So that almost didn't happen. And this was like a couple of days beforehand. So I cleared it up with them. There wasn't a big deal with that. And, they obviously saw that it was, them airing the footage. And of course they played it that night, and that was exciting. I was actually still in the chat room at that time for that actually. And so everybody was really excited about that. So that was cool. I mean, that was, probably, one of the last, kind of good moments we had kind of in that chat before I ended up leaving there. But yeah, it was that was kind of a moment where, all that was kind of coming together, and it was a fan kind of thing to do and all that. And it was before the Jason Leffler thing and all that too. So it was before I was kind of committing more to the website. So I wasn't really established in anything beyond really the starting grids. And even that was kind of a niche thing too, but a lot of fun though. I mean, it's still a moment that I remember very fondly, and I still have that clip on the YouTube channel. And I really appreciate that I got picked out of the stack there. I still have the helmet down in my storage room there too. We're looking for a good place to put it here at Lastcar headquarters.
Yeah, well, just to continue the YouTube discussion here, I want to ask you about some of your recent projects aside from the lap 11 video. I just recently rewatched 3 Before February, and I imagine you said putting the Dan Weldon video together was pretty tough. I imagine that had to have been similarly difficult to relive and put together. And I'm looking at this as somebody who was I can say I wasn't around. I guess I was 1 year old at the time all that was going down. So I obviously don't have any memories of that. How did the idea for that project come together? And it's almost an hour and a half long. So I imagine there was a lot of extensive research that went into that as well.
Certainly, and that was a project that was a long time coming. Pretty much really from back in 2001 itself. I mean, even after Dale Earnhardt's accident, because once Earnhardt's accident happened, things happened really quick, and there were these developments in safety, and everybody's like, oh well, it's terrible that we lost the Intimidator, and absolutely it is. I mean, we miss him every day. The sport isn't the same without him. But this narrative that was created very quickly to say, oh, well, Dale Earnhardt happened, and then all these safety advancements happened just because of him. It's very easy to forget, and I think has been forgotten largely, how nerve-wracking that season was. I was 18 years old during that 2000 season. So I remembered it very clearly, not in the same way as Rick Houston, of course. He was working in the media at that time and actually was, had met all these drivers before. So he had a very good account of it in his Firestorm as well. But I've noticed that in his Firestorm podcast, he and I kind of disagree on different elements of it. In my mind, what was really challenging with that whole time period is that, you had these three drivers, between Adam Petty, Kenny Irwin Jr., and Tony Roper, that much like a lot of drivers that get featured on Lastcar are drivers that maybe even back then weren't big time names in the sport, weren't talked about that much. Kenny Irwin Jr. actually was the first driver I ever wanted to interview, even before I had any inkling of trying to get into motorsports media. I'd always hoped to maybe do play-by-play or something someday, but I never really thought about like interviewing drivers or anything. But I remember as a kid, following the sport at Irwin's first couple of seasons, he always looked really distracted. He always looked kind of worried or frustrated. And I'm sure he was when he was, in that high pressure ride with the Robert Yates team. And of course he was looking to get a fresh start with the Sabatas effort. And he had that good run at Talladega in the spring. And I remember how exciting that was. Like, man, maybe this guy's going to win something someday. And then when that accident happened, all three of those accidents were devastating tragedies, but Irwin's in particular always really stood out to me. And the fact that his was forgotten so much after Dale Earnhardt's accident, as well as both Adam Petty's and Tony Roper's too, it's always been kind of in the back of my mind of doing some kind of project on it. I thought about making it a book, but at the same time, I didn't want to get in a rut with what I had done with the JD McDuffie book and then just keep doing stories about tragic aspects of the sport. I didn't want to be known as the person who just does stories like that, because I think there's a lot of positive things about the sport that have kept me interested in the sport and still do. In fact, my Derek Cope book that I'm working on is definitely a departure from that. And the next one I'm working on after that is another too. But, obviously looking at the footage, it kind of occurred to me, well, maybe this should be a YouTube video. And that was kind of my thought. I was just make it kind of a YouTube video to kind of offer a chronology of all the events that happened. And I never really thought about it being like a feature. So the first version of it that I posted was just I was kind of amazed at how long it was. I was like, oh, nobody's going to watch all this. But I felt this was a story that needed to be told, and as impartially as possible. I mean, there's a couple parts in it that's very challenging to do so. But that was the biggest focus. And on that, the research, J-Ski was the biggest part of that. They kept fantastic archives of even little moments. Like there's an incident with Kenny Irwin Jr.'s hauler leading into the 2000 season. I want to make sure to include like little bits of information, even things like that, because, it kind of fits all together there. And I probably could have split it into 3 parts and just had 3 videos on it, but I don't think that would have been as effective, because a lot of those stories, as I described in the opening of it, they're intertwined. Whether it's the Sabatas effort or Adam Petty going in the Xfinity or the Busch Series at the time, or Tony Roper, also struggling at the same New Hampshire track. I wanted to kind of I wanted to experience it as I experienced it, that you started with the season, there's all this excitement. It's NASCAR 2000. They got this whole program going. They got these new cars, new paint schemes. And it was exciting. I mean, I remember as a kid printing out pictures of all the cars because I wanted to find them all in diecast, because that was a big thing. But then starting in May, you just had all these terrible things happen. And at a time where we hadn't really had fatalities in the sport in a few years. I know Emp Lemon in his video on Dale Earnhardt kind of colored a picture of it to make it seem like deaths were more frequent in the sport. It had been a few years since John Hunter's in the Truck Series, even further back in Cup. And in the Busch Series, even back to Clifford Allison in 1992. So there was a long time where there was, I would say, some complacency in there. And, one of my first passions historically has been the Titanic disaster. And I see some comparisons there. there's these warnings that this thing is happening. And when you put it all together in hindsight, it just seems like so obvious. And you're like, how on earth did everybody just let this happen, not have all these accidents happen, and still say going into 2001, oh, we're not sure if the Hans device is ready. Oh, we're not sure if we need to take any other measures, just having nothing happen. And then Dale Earnhardt happens, and suddenly it's a whole different story. I think that's the most accurate way to portray that. I definitely remember the anger at the time, how unnecessary all that was, and how could it have happened. And I thought, looking back on it, maybe you would clear it up and say, oh, well, maybe, there's an explanation here or there. But actually, when I looked at it, I was more upset about it. It's like how on earth could this have happened? And this is where I think, and again, I really appreciate, Rick Houston professionally as well. And I thought he did a fantastic job on Firestorm. But I think one of the biggest aspects that we disagree on between my project and his is the role of Dale Earnhardt in those incidents. It's obviously, it's always been said, and Rick's been among these too, that who's going to be the person to tell Dale Earnhardt that he has to wear a Hans device? Who's going to be the person that's going to tell him he has to? But clearly somebody had to. And I know that there's other issues there as well, that there was a culture in the garage area that people just didn't ask about safety. If you're worried about safety, you should be out there and things like that. And he was privy to that information that I wasn't. So, and again, I encourage your listeners to check out his project as well. If they've seen 3 Before February, I highly recommend checking out Firestorm, his podcast there as well. But in my project, and it was challenging to do because it's not a pleasant thing to think about. I'm much more critical of Dale Earnhardt's role in what happened there, that he was the figurehead. He was the leader in the garage area. Jeff Burton was kind of on the rise, but he was still he wasn't fully, the one that everybody was consulting at the time. Dale Earnhardt was kind of the leader, and everybody kind of followed his example. And I always think about it in a professional example, that everybody who's worked any job has been around that one person that, they said they tend to get away with things that everybody else can't, just because they've been around for longer. And as much as I hate to say it, looking back on it, I think Earnhardt was that figure in that example, and it's awful. I mean, obviously, I'm sure if he had any inkling that something like that was going to happen to him, things would have turned out differently. And and God knows, I would have hoped that it would have happened too. But I just think that clearly there, and it's not all on Earnhardt. I don't want to make it sound like that either. I think NASCAR should have been more firm. I think they should have taken a much more assertive stance on it, and really taken the initiative. And the fact also, and again, this is something that Rick does a really good job on too. He brings up Blaise Alexander a lot more. In mine, I kind of bring it up as an after a statement there, because that's kind of where I wanted to leave the story, because even the narrative that Dale Earnhardt brought in the Hans device isn't entirely true. It wasn't until after that, all the way in October with Blaise Alexander's accident, that the mandate was actually put in place. So it was a challenging project. It was definitely, again, much like with Until Lap 11, kind of captured a different time in my life, more as a fan really, than kind of more on the media side of it. But that was kind of the emotions that were kind of going into it there. But again, yeah, it's a complicated subject. I think that you could have a half dozen people tackle it, and we'll get a half dozen completely different interpretations of it. But I think that's kind of where my frustrations of it are. But again, I want to be clear that it's very possible that there's a lot of details that I wasn't privy to, because at the time, of course, I was just a fan. I was just a kid. I tapped into a lot of my own memories of it, verifying the details from my research, of course. But inevitably, the way that the experience is going to be colored is from my view as a fan, whereas somebody with Rick Houston's experience as a media member, it's going to be vastly different, having met all these people before. So again, I would absolutely encourage your viewers to check out both projects there if they're interested. I think if you watch both of them, I think a combination of the both of them is probably going to be the most accurate concept of what that season was like.
Yeah, well, it reminds me, just thinking back to Weldon's accident. I remember the day before the Vegas race, seeing James Jakes' crash. And obviously, James Jakes wasn't too seriously injured. I mean, for crying out loud, he raced the next day or the next 2 days. I guess it was on a Friday practice or whenever it was. But just from him hitting the wall and what is not an uncommon kind of accident, to see how much damage was done, kind of worried me for when you put 33 other cars, for total 34 cars out there, what could possibly happen. And I even think back to when Briscoe and Tagliani touched wheels, and if an accident had happened there, probably would have collected even more than the 15 cars that the accident that did happen collected. But just drawing it all back, it seemed to me like, looking back on it, with 10 years of hindsight now, it's kind of a similar sort of thing there, where, there are a lot of warning signs that maybe this isn't such a good idea. Maybe there are things that we're overlooking here in regards to safety, and yet it ended up happening that way.
That's a very, very good point. And, I think that's kind of where the challenge is, where you can kind of see this in NASCAR Man's video as well, his Perfect Storm video. I think at the time it was so hard to kind of view it in such a way where is this too much, and when I didn't really realize, because again, my exposure to IndyCar was very limited. I was kind of brought in. I was kind of one of those fans that kind of got brought into the sport by the efforts that Randy Bernard was making to make IndyCar more interesting and to kind of recover the sport from the reunification after the split. And so that was kind of my frame of reference. I didn't have a vast knowledge of what kind of racing should you have on 1.5 mile tracks, and what is an unacceptable level of risk for IndyCar. Of course, my frame of reference is NASCAR. So when I see pack racing, when I see large fields, I'm all on board. Back in 2011, I'm like, this is fantastic. I'm thinking much like the 2001 Daytona 500, when they had this aero package that Dale Earnhardt did win his last race with. They're going to bring it to Daytona. They had record numbers of lead changes, unbelievable competition, unbelievably clean racing in the Daytona 500. But obviously the Tony Stewart wreck is a massive exception, but it's easy to forget that wreck was happening with like 25 laps to go and almost the entire field was still running. A lot of the racing that entire week was very clean. And I think in the IndyCar thing it almost had that aspect. I mean, they had the James Jakes accident you mentioned, of course, but then all the other practice sessions, qualifying sessions, and even those first few laps of the race were run very clean, pointing to the skill of the drivers. But you mentioned, of course, the contact with Tagliani there. And you see this in the chat transcript in my video. Once that happens, the tone of the chat, it changes very much. It's all of a sudden like everybody's just kind of relaxed and kind of enjoying it, and they're hoping it's there's some concerns. There's a few people that are concerned, but then once that happens, suddenly it kind of shifts gears, and everybody's just like, oh my God, this is too much. This is out of control. But of course, it's too late by that point. What are you going to do? You're going to throw a red flag and stop the race and say that it's too much? I mean, the drivers have no control over it because they're drivers. They're going to go out there and try to compete. And then of course the accident happens, and that's. And I think that's, and I didn't like one thing with until lap 11 that I wasn't entirely comfortable with doing was bringing a lot more of myself into it, because it's really about, it's about Dan, it's about the circumstances that led up to the accident. But I do think that my own experience of trying to juggle your view as a fan or your view as a media person was really challenged by that event. And I think I wasn't the only one. I think anybody that was in the media center at Vegas was like that too, or maybe they were there. Oriol Servia said, it's like, look, you guys are going to have a lot of exciting stuff to write about. And I'm sure if I was in the media center, I'd be like, oh man, this is going to be a really exciting race. It's going to have some crazy, it might have a photo finish like they had at Kentucky. It's going to be exciting. And you almost kind of go in, you kind of take a step back more into that fan aspect where maybe more as a media member, you kind of look at things a little more critically. You try not to get, let your excitement go in and try to see what's actually happening. And maybe if something like that happened, maybe something different would have happened. But clearly that wasn't the case. I mean, and again, much like with the 2001 Daytona 500, that was something that I had experienced at a much older age. one thing that really struck me out of the comments, even just a couple more I received today, was how young people were when they saw this accident. How, you mentioned that you were very young during the 2000 accidents there. But I mean, there were some people that were, even younger. Maybe they were only like, 7 or 8 people that were about the same age I was when I went to my first NASCAR race in 1992. And this was their first exposure to it, or something that happened at a very young age. I think there were people that, for them, this was a moment that was just too awful to even think about. And that really came across both in my video and NASCAR Man's video as well. And I really had no idea that it was going to be just that reaction was just that profound. I mean, obviously, as awful as it was, luckily it affected me in a different way. But I mean, I can't imagine what it would have been like for somebody at an even more impressionable age to have seen it at that time. I mean, it must have just been awful. But obviously I can't comment on that experience, but that was, very much the case.
Yeah, well, I was 12, so it was that's
There you go.
yeah, pretty traumatizing for me. And I think it's to this day, it's the only fatality I've watched, where I've been watching the race live as it was unfolding. I have limited access to cable, so the Justin Wilson crash, I wasn't watching that Pocono race at a time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's something that was tough for me for a while, and I still don't think I'm completely over. I don't think I'll ever completely be over.
Yeah.
But that was very tough, and I have several friends I can think of. Maybe even have to go on to second hand, to have enough fingers to count the number of people that, like, the 2011 500 that year was their first IndyCar race, or that was their first, or Vegas was their first IndyCar race. It was something that was at the very beginning of when they were exposed to that side of motor racing as a fan. So to have that happen, and that kind of be your first experience, or you see Dan win this race in this stunning fashion, and then less than 5 months later he's taken from us. I can speak from my perspective how hard that was, to even be a few years younger. It must only get harder from there.
Certainly. I mean, every generation has these, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to compare these, whether it's people, your parents or grandparents, talking about where they were when they heard the Kennedy was assassinated in 1960s, or where they were when the Challenger exploded in 1980s. I mean, things that were, things much like Dale Earnhardt's accident or Dan Weldon's accident, that had an air of anticipation, that that nobody's really worried about anything bad happening. Everybody's kind of having it, and then in an instant, a person or several people are just taken from us, and dealing with that. I think every generation has that moment, and I think and there's been other ones outside of motorsports for ours. I mean, obviously, September 11th has left an indelible mark on everybody. But I think in motorsports as well, I mean, for people that are motorsports fans, or maybe even had just a passing interest in it, either Dale Earnhardt's accident, or even especially Dan Weldon's accident, for just the sheer nature of the wreck, it's definitely left its mark.
Yeah, well, I guess we can shift gears into maybe something a little bit more
Sure.
lighthearted and uplifting here. I've really been enjoying your Rise of the Field Fillers series that you've been working on for the last several months now, and I don't even know how many episodes. I think you're up to 8 or 9 episodes right now.
Yeah, I believe we're working on 9 right now, so that's that's still going along.
Yeah, so obviously that kind of feeds into the mission of Lastcar, and a lot of similar kind of teams and drivers that are featured more frequently on the site. You're featuring in these videos here. But what kind of launched the idea for this series? And obviously there's been several clips and interviews there as well. So how much work have you had to put into those? And I know you say you're working on episode 9 now. When can we expect that to come out?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, field fillers, again, keeping with the interest of doing lighter subjects in the books, like I mentioned, the Derek Cope book being the next one of those. Field fillers back in 2019 or 2018, 2019, when the JD McDuffie book came out, I decided the Field Fillers was going to be the next book I was going to work on. That was the original plan. And so I was already compiling a lot of research in late 2018, early 2019. And that was kind of my big focus. And I was like, oh, this will be neat. This will be a very different thing. The working title was going to be called Field Fillers in 2004. And I was going to kind of take a lighthearted look at these teams and kind of write it out in a book. And I got a ways into it. I hadn't completed any interviews, but the more I worked on it, I kind of reached a stalling point. Like suddenly the project just wasn't advancing. Like I was writing chapters out, but it was very cursory. Like I wasn't actually, it was just statistics. It's just saying like, oh, this person qualified, this person didn't qualify. And I had some information on some of these teams, but I didn't have it to a satisfactory degree that I could really indulge in those details to the same degree that I did in the JD book. So it basically sat on my hard drive for a bit, and I ended up going towards the Derek Cope book after that. And then that had more momentum, and that was easier to do. I think the challenging part with Field Fillers was so much of the material was video. And so I felt like I was transcribing a lot of video footage or trying to make, focusing so much on trying to make that something you could picture in your mind. And it finally occurred to me August of, I guess it was last year or 2 years ago. That was like, what the heck am I doing? It's like, this would be a great video series. Like, I mean, instead of transcribing all this stuff, let's just put the video clips in there and let's just do that. And so these first few chapters, the first few parts of it were really going to be what were the parts of the book. I mean, the episode 1 was pretty much word for word what was going to be in the book to start off and describing all that. And of course, the visuals of showing the teams, the number of teams shrinking and increasing. I mean, that worked so much better in the video. So at that point, I almost, at that point, it really kicked it into overdrive, and I was starting to kind of reorganize it and, get this material together. And it came together so much quicker, and being able to write it, knowing I had visuals to rely on. And then really after the first couple episodes, the interviews was kind of a latter aspect to it. I had found a couple clips of Kirk Shelverdine. I got a contact information from him, from a friend. And unfortunately he didn't pick up, so I couldn't get an interview with him. But then I got a hold of Dean Arnold right before Thanksgiving for that episode. And he was relaxing and stuff like that. And he gave some great stories, and that kind of started that aspect of it. I'm not sure if I'll be able to get that into every episode, but I've been pleased with who's been able to respond so far. Stan Hoover, Morgan Shepherd, of course, Carl Long, and so forth. And it's really kind of taken on a life of its own. It's actually, and it's finally, it's really the flagship series now on this on my channel there, because before this, I'd always had the starting grids kind of be in that position. But again, like I said, they kind of plateaued after a bit, and I still like doing them on occasion, but I get so many questions all the time, like, when's the next episode? When's the next episode? Who's it going to be on? And that's been really exciting. So to answer your question, yeah, the next episode on Score Motorsports and Hermie Sadler, I'm currently in the process of arranging an interview with Hermie. We haven't spoken yet, but I'm hoping to get that in the project and get that together. The script is pretty much done. I'm going to basically be interviewing with him to kind of fill some gaps in there and make some other corrections in the script before I start recording it. I was hoping to get it done sometime this month. It might end up early December, but nothing firm yet. But of course, the updates will be in both my Patreon, patreon.com/Lastcar on Brock, or my Twitter feed at Lastcar on Brock. I'll have more information on that. And in the meantime, I'm still working on doing some shorter form videos as well on other drivers along the way to kind of fill these gaps up. I'm hoping over this off season, I'll be able to set up a more regular upload schedule, so the wait between episodes isn't quite as long for everyone.
Yeah, well, I think back to, I became a fan around when Pixar released Cars, so 2006, 2007. So, 04, obviously I have a lot of knowledge of that era just from being a fan and kind of reliving that time, and looking at racing reference and videos like yours and everything. But I think of when the recession hit and a lot of teams were closing down. There was a pretty big increase in the starting part teams, particularly in Cup Series around 2009, with Tommy Baldwin and Joe Nemechek bringing his team back to Cup. and other teams like that. So I'm curious, obviously you've been focusing on 2004 for the series. How long or how many episodes, I guess, are you planning to do? And is this something that you're just going to keep focused on the 2004 season, or do you have plans to look a little bit even further down the road there?
Stay tuned. I'll definitely tell you. Stay tuned on that. It's the series is not. I'm not planning on writing the last episode of it anytime soon here. So there's a couple of interesting surprises that are going to be coming up here the next few that I'm very excited about. This story doesn't have a clear finish line as of yet. So all that is still definitely on the table here, and hopefully, I can keep the same format. And big thanks again to everybody that's volunteered for interviews, and a particular shout out to Brian Hallman at the BRH Racing Archives. He and I have been talking ever since I was back in high school, sharing old pictures, because back then I was even starting to talk about JD McDuffie, and he was sharing some of his old pictures of JD back then. And so we built up a friendship since then, and he's been a tremendous help in finding some of these great rare photos and stuff. And whenever he sends over, I try to put as many of those in the video as I can, because it really helps kind of illustrate just the very humble origins of these drivers and teams. And that's something that's definitely going to be continuing on in the series.
Yeah, well, I'm looking at the clock now. I guess we're coming up on an hour here already, and I wanted to get in. Yeah, I wanted to get into JD a little bit tonight, but
no,
I don't know. Maybe
going. I'm flexible right now, so I can go as long as you need to.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm trying. Like I said, I'd love to have you back at some point, in the not too distant future. But I guess to kind of cap it off here, I know obviously JD was your first actual published book. I know obviously you have the Kindle books with the Lastcar statistics and everything, but like you mentioned, you're working on a book now on Derek Cope, who just recently retired, and obviously Starcom Racing unfortunately closing their doors. I'm curious, how did that project get started, and is it, I assume you're taking probably a slightly different approach than you took with JD's book, and I guess just to wrap it up, I know you said you don't have a firm release date yet, but when can we expect that book to hit the shelves here?
Certainly. And that was kind of the big thing between these two books. I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. In the case of JD, that was really kind of the first kind of, I guess, mystery is probably too strong of a term, but just like subject in NASCAR history that I really kind of grabbed onto, probably really around the same 2000 season. In fact, that was, I mean, by the time during a lot of what was happening in the 2000 and 2001 season was about the same time that I was kind of starting to learn more about JD. And so that the book that came out in 2018, that was basically the result of it had always been kind of in the background. Like whatever I was doing, if I found like some little scrap of anything about JD, I would kind of put it in my archives. And I didn't have really a real firm idea of what it was going to be for. But by about 2016, I read this book called Killer Show. That's on, highly recommend it. It's a book that's a very harrowing account of the Station nightclub fire that happened in 2003 that claimed the lives of 100 people. And it's written by this attorney. I believe his name is John Barelik. He provided this incredible account of it that really made you feel like you were there. Like, I mean, and to an incredible degree, very comprehensive. And really, when I read that book, I was thinking, is there a subject that because I always had an interest in writing, but is there a subject that I have that level of interest in or want to attain that level of knowledge of to write a book about? And instantly, JD McDuffie. And so the first chapter I wrote was what I knew about the Watkins Glen race, and I kind of expanded it outward from there. Talking to one person and another kind of led to the interviews, and that's how that project came together. Derek Cope, like I mentioned, after the field fillers thing kind of stalled, I figured, okay, well, it has to be on I wanted to have it be similar enough to the JD project, but not with a tragic aspect of it. And I felt the first differentiation I wanted to make was do it on a driver that won a race. And who better among underdogs that won a race than a person whose first win was in the Daytona 500? And Derek Cope actually was the first driver I was actually a fan of. So he kind of had that aspect going full circle. I posted the picture a few times on Twitter that when I went to my first race in 1992, I was wearing a pink Mickey Mouse hat. We went to Disneyland earlier that summer. And I was on my with my folks there and reached over the fence, and he signed it. I still have it in the box in my bedroom. And it's that was the first autograph I ever got. And I always liked his paint job. That was the first thing that attracted me to it. I loved the orange and white Pure Later car. I followed other drivers over the years. Jerry Nadeau, of course, ended up being really a driver that I followed much more closely from the beginning part of his career, which is why I still say that Jerry is still probably my all-time favorite driver. But Derek Cope's always been in the conversation for being a driver that I'd followed at such a formative time in my life. And so when the JD project came up and wanting to do something, that wasn't a story of a tragedy, definitely Derek came into the conversation there. And also, incidentally, of course, a driver that had a lot of adversity that he had to overcome, had a lot of last place finishes. I mentioned earlier, he actually was the first driver I saw that had a clear lead in the Lastcar standings when I went back to '98. And I wanted to kind of learn more about that 1990 Daytona 500 win and some of these other teams that he drove for, and then of course, you mentioned him running for Starcom, and then going back to the Daytona 500, unfortunately finishing last in that. It just seemed like he just kept popping up over and over again, and so I kind of wanted to get that set. So by February, when he was getting ready to run the Daytona 500, it's like this is a perfect opportunity to set at least set a goal for a release date by the end of the year. I'd actually received, I've been talking with some publishers, and unfortunately, a couple of them basically said, well, we don't know if a Derek Cope book is going to sell. Well, I'd heard the same thing about JD McDuffie, and Waldorf Publishing will certainly be the first to tell you that they were very happy to pick up that book because a lot of people were very interested in the story of JD. Very surprised that people aren't getting the same reaction out of Derek. But I'm confident that we're still going to find somebody interested in it there. But obviously, with the new news coming up there with Starcom Racing shutting down, and also I got actually I'll tell you this. I mean, one other thing, talk about weird overlap there. During the race itself, when Quinn Houff had the accident about halfway through the Phoenix race, I was in the parking lot, the competitor parking lot, with Derek and his wife Alicia, pulling out a copy of my manuscript from his car. He'd actually taken notes on it to give me some more, kind of help me, correct some dates and other information there. And I talked with Alicia, and she gave me some more information on it. So I want to definitely make sure that I'm putting all those notes in there too. So it's, as sad as it is their team shut down, I think there is an opportunity in there to bring that part into the story as well. So I'm very optimistic that, this next round of edits here, I think is going to make the book absolutely ready to go. And I was already feeling good about it before, but Alicia told me, it's like, oh, you got to talk more about, like, this is what happened during this DNQ at Daytona, or this is what happened at this race in Phoenix or something. It's like, okay, this is going to be more than just one time sitting here. We're gonna get all this information. So let's set up some Skype calls. And that's kind of one other thing I'll be working on this off season here, and definitely looking forward to it. But hopefully by that point, I think that's only going to make it easier to market the book. And hopefully by then we'll be able to reel in a publisher and set it a date there. So no date set yet. Next year at the absolute earliest, but all these publishers work differently. But I'm very excited about what we're going to be adding in this next round here. And I think it'll make it all ready to go.
That's just an interesting nugget I just thought of. First race I ever watched was I have a video on this on my channel, the 2006 fall race at Talladega. And I think Derek was driving for McLin Racing at the time, and I believe I know he started in last place. I believe he finished in last as well that day.
He did.
So that was that's kind of an interesting connection there, I suppose. But
that's right. Yeah, I forgot you did the video on that, right? Because you did that. So yeah, there you go. Yeah. So I think that was when Derek set the single season last place record that Dave Blaney broke a couple of years later too. So that was a very significant race in Lastcar history. And then of course what happened at the front of the field there. But yeah, I enjoyed that video.
Yeah. I'm still working. I've got one more plan of that series I've been pushing aside because I've been working on other projects, but working on getting my first F1 race video out there. So hopefully sometime this off season I'll get around to rewatching Canada 2014, and we'll get that out there. But
there we go.
I guess on that note, Brock, I just I want to thank you in particular for proofreading the script for my Panther racing video, because that was certainly something that I've worked very hard on. Wanted to try to. I probably started a little bit too late, to be honest. I obviously wanted to get it out when the anniversary came up, because I thought that was the perfect time to release it. So I greatly appreciate you taking a look at the script and suggesting some tweaks here or there, and I'm very happy with how it came out. So I'm very appreciative that you took the time to do that, and of course for giving me the chance to write for your site as well. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Happy to have you on board for sure. And I'm glad it could be help on your video. I really enjoyed it. I'm trying to keep spreading the word about it there, because I think you filled in some gaps that my video and NASCAR Man's video didn't really talk about, and the whole context of why that win was so meaningful for Dan, and the fact that it was that Dan Weldon and the Panther Racing team just continue to kind of be part of the same story right up to the end, even in Las Vegas itself. I thought you did a great job capturing that. So I think that's, that's one thing that's so encouraging, is that so many people were talking about it. And I think in a sense, it was cathartic, I think, for a lot of people that hadn't even wanted to think about it these 10 years. I think a lot of good was done that day, and you were certainly a part of that. So kudos to you for sure.
Yeah. Well, and Vitor as well, I don't want to forget about him. In 2008, I remember watching that race too. And, sticking with the theme of underdogs, and Vitor's got to be one of the best drivers, in my opinion, but never won an IndyCar series race. I think like even Marty Reed, when he was calling Hildebrand home on the final lap, he was like, well, Panther Racing's finished second twice here with Weldon. And, I'm thinking in my head, well, it's actually 3 in a row now. And of course became 4 in a row with Hildebrand, because Mira had that run where he came so close in 08. So, it's one of those interesting stretches where, like, what are the chances that you would finish in the same position 4 years in a row, anywhere in the field, let alone, to come so close to winning it. So such a shame that they never broke through. But like I mentioned in my video, if you just even swap one of those years, and give Panther the win, it's crazy to think about how different history might be today and what we'd be looking at there. So, like I said, I appreciate you taking a look at the script, and I'm glad you enjoyed what we were able to put together there.
Certainly.
Yeah. All right. Well, like I said, I'd love to have you back at some point, but thank you so much for taking the time to join me tonight. And I'm looking forward to some of the projects you have upcoming. And like I said, I'm sure next time we get together on one of these calls, we'll have a lot to talk about there. So thanks again. Absolutely. And enjoy the rest of your night.
All right. You as well. Thank you so much for having me on. And happy holidays if I don't see you before then.
Yeah, sounds good.